Stanford University.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Sally, and it's great to be here. When I decided to come out to California, I was told I wouldn't have to wear a tie. And unfortunately, Hoover has a shindig going on tonight, so I'm all gussied up for that. But the other thing I have to warn you about is I'm not going to be using any PowerPoint today. For the last 4 years, I've been in Washington dealing with defense issues and defense budgets, and I've joined PowerPoint Anonymous. And my therapist said, don't touch PowerPoints for 2 years because you've been overexposed and it won't be healthy for you. I mean, the place lives and dies on PowerPoints. But I really appreciate the opportunity to come together. I'd just like to talk about a few things, and most importantly, then field any questions that you have. And my focus will be on what the military is doing with respect to energy, and it'll come as no surprise that I'm going to be heavily biased toward the Navy, because that's where my focus was and where I believe we set in motion some good things. I have to also confess that energy has been part of my entire life. My father was in the oil business and spent about 50 years in the Middle East. So my earliest memories are the smells of petroleum and oil refineries and everything else that went on. But as a result of that, for me, it was thinking about energy, energy resources, and the geopolitical issues that affect it has been with me all the time. And then when you move into the military, energy matters a lot. And it's not just today. If you in the Navy, if you go back in the beginning of time, in order to move, you had some form of energy, wind, galley slaves, all of that comes into play. And then we started getting into fossil fuels, and then eventually into nuclear power. And now the Navy is starting to branch into alternative forms of energy. So it's always part of what you do. I will tell you, as a commander, you're thinking about it all the time. There's a great saying about logisticians who in the military are the ones that are always thinking about feeding and fueling. And there's a term that I like to use for logisticians. They're that sad, embittered race of men, because everybody hates them, but you can't do without them. So, absolutely key. And I think it's really interesting for those who may have studied World War II history in the Pacific. There was one of our great fighting admirals by the name of Bull Halsey. And he was a very tough guy. And someone asked him after the war, what won the war for you? And he said, first thing, submarines. And what did the submarines do in the Pacific? They strangled the energy supply to Japan. Then the second thing, he said, were oilers, the ships that carry the fuel that kept the fleet going as we marched across the Pacific. And then the third thing were our construction battalions, who built the facilities that allowed the logistics to feed the fight. I think it's remarkable that the only real weapon of war that someone would conjure up is the submarine. Everything else dealt with logistics and feeding and fueling the fleet. And even today, when I was commanding ships and the naval forces, my mind was always on fuel, because you live and die by it. And in fact, when we were flying over Iraq, and the sailors that sit at the consoles that control the airplane, I had them make up signs. I didn't care if they were printed. I didn't care if they were in crayon. We had think gas. Because if you're not thinking about it, you're going to put somebody in trouble. And as you plan for movements, you're always thinking about how vulnerable will I become if I have to stop and slow down and deal with energy issues. So in the case of the Navy, if you look at energy, we spend about 75% of our energy on the operating forces, the ships, the airplanes, and about 25% on what we call the shore infrastructure, all the base infrastructure. And even though we use a lot of fuel, we only use about 0.4% of the national usage. We burn a lot, but nationally it's relatively a small amount. That doesn't mean that we're cavalier about it. Just as an example, what our fuel bill was. When the price of fuel went up $1, I didn't even have to worry about calculating. I had a mental calculator. When the price of fuel went up $1, I knew my budget was going to require $34 million more, because that's how much we're using. The military on any given day will burn about 340,000 barrels of fuel a day, and that's global. So the last job I had in the Navy was I was responsible for the Navy, for its operation, for its effectiveness, but I also had to think about the future. And it was very important for me to take that long view of where we were going. And I will tell you that my sense in Washington is that that long view is in short supply. And that's just the way it is. But I think if we don't change our way of looking at the future, or if we don't change that temporal reference point, we're going to be shooting behind the target every time. So as I came into that position, I'd been very conscious of energy and fuel. And I thought about where we were going in the future with the Navy. I knew that we had to get our arms around energy, because I looked at the things that we were buying for the future. And then we projected out what I call total ownership costs. When we buy something in the government, we have a strange way of looking at it. We buy something because of the cheapest price. And I looked at what we were buying, how much it was going to cost us 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And I knew that if we didn't get our arms around energy, my successors, many times removed, would be cursing me in my grave, because we were delivering something to them that was going to rapidly become unaffordable to own. And I don't like to do a lot of ad hoc organizations. I prefer to make an organization work. But in this case, as I look to the future, I stood up 2 task forces. They were the only 2 that I stood up during my time as the CNO. One was on climate change, and one was on energy. And you may say, well, why climate change? The planet's changing, and in Washington it's very easy to get into the political debate about climate change. And my view was, it's changing. Physically, the planet is going to be different 20, 25 years from now. I want to think that through and not get into a debate about the whys and the wherefores, because it's gone. And everyone immediately assumed that it was all about the Arctic. And the Arctic is important. There's no question about it. It's the most significant change that's happened on the planet since the end of the last ice age. And what it means is that the high north is going to change. It's going to open for fishing, it's going to open for resources, and it's going to open for transportation. And I wanted to be able to think through, what does that mean for our military and for our Navy? If you consider the fact that the fish are going to move with the water temperature, the fishing fleets are going to start to operate a lot farther north, and they'll be well above the Arctic Circle in a few short years. And that means that there'll be disputes over fishing areas. It means that, who's watched The Most Dangerous Catch? People are going to get in trouble. Search and rescue operations are going to be there. We don't have any infrastructure in place to really do that effectively. So we wanted to look at that. Trade between Asia and Europe is going to change markedly. You're going to be able to go from China to Europe in a week shorter, which in today's dollars is about $1 million less per trip. That's what will happen. And then the resources that exist up there are going to be extraordinarily attractive. And it's not just oil and gas. Some of the estimates that you see for rare earth minerals are pretty extraordinary. In fact, as people look at concessions, many of those concessions really deal with rare earth. And so I think you're going to see that exploration going on up there. The other thing that's happening is as the climate changes, we think in terms of the ice going away, but the insects are migrating farther north. They're taking, there are new disease vectors as a result of that. Vegetation is changing. The permafrost is thawing, upheaving the earth. And there's a whole population whose way of life that goes back for millennia is gone. And so what do you do with the indigenous population, and how does all that fit together? So I wanted to find out about that, and my interest in it has continued. And in fact, I'm leading a project here between Hoover Institution and Brookings in Washington on the Arctic, where I hope that we get some more coherent policy that ties together security, energy, indigenous populations, and the environment. Because all four of those factors have to be considered in balance in my mind. But the climate change is also, to me, almost like a crystal ball as to where there'll be friction and strife and conflict, largely driven by change in seawater levels. The Arctic's not going to have anything to do with that because the ices will melt, and so no change. But the cap on Greenland will have an effect. Antarctica will have an effect, and we have somebody who's getting ready to tear off down there this summer. And so, what does that mean? The number of megacities on the coast will be affected by those conditions. And the other thing that will happen, and we can talk about energy a lot and how important it is and how we have to have solutions for the future. But to me, one of the most pressing things we're going to deal with in the next 20 years is water, available fresh water. We're going to find an alternative to energy. I mean, we're already seeing it. But if anybody in here has an alternative to water, if you put your hand up and we'll go make $1 million or whatever. But we're beginning to see water supplies becoming problematic. We're beginning already to see great friction over the great rivers and where they're controlled and what they feed. In Southeast Asia, it's the Mekong. In India, the Ganges. Somebody told me that there's some water issues out here in the West. And, but this is going to become a big deal. So climate change was to try to give us a common view, not necessarily of exact things that will happen, but what did we have to think about? The other thing that climate change brings into the picture, even though the ice will clear and transportation routes and activity will increase in the Arctic, it's still going to be a horrendously nasty place to be. It's going to be cold, it's going to be rough. So ship designs have to change as a result of that. If you look at a ship today, all of the heating and ventilation and air conditioning systems are sized and designed for a particular band of temperatures that are normally where we operate. If you start getting into the high north, all that has to change. The way a ship is designed now, it's still going to get pretty icy up there in the bad months. And one of the things that happens on a ship, you start to accumulate ice up in the high areas of the ship. And now your stability starts to get strange. So new topside designs are going to be required that don't allow that accumulation of ice. So all of these things I wanted to start thinking about, because if you're trying to buy a Navy for the future, you have to start thinking years in advance. From inception to ship in the water is normally about a 12-year process. So, you know, you want to start the R&D, you want to start the design process, and then you get into the contractual issues later on. So that's what climate change is going to do. I apologize for diverging on it, but it's something that I think is hugely important. And then the other one was task force energy. Huge energy costs as we go into the future. And when you look at it from the standpoint of having the Navy that we have today, and I mentioned 75% usage at sea and 25 ashore, you have different problems. And you also have the old and the new. You know, we're not going to say we have to become more energy efficient, so we're going to take today's Navy and flush it down a drain and build a whole new one. It's just not going to work that way. So as we began to look at how do you handle the problem, that we kind of put it in those 4 blocks: afloat, ashore, new, and old. And it used to get very frustrating. You'd say, well, you know, how are we going to take on this energy problem? They said, but we're designing this new ship. We have this new ship. Well, when are you going to have one? Well, we're going to have one 5 years from now. Okay, I have 300 others that are still there, and how do we think our way through? And then the idea of the task force also allowed us to bring the senior leadership together to get a more common view of what we were dealing with. Because I'll tell you, the biggest issue in any large organization, particularly a large public organization, is trying to overcome culture. And so we had to, you know, make people believe, cause people to get away from that very short focal length that they had, and get out and start talking about things that were out there. The other phrase that I like is, you know, whatever the boss finds interesting, everybody else finds fascinating. So that was all part of bringing the senior leadership along, and then making sure that the initiatives that you put in place today are able to continue on. And in an organization where you can generate a lot of inertia, like the military, you really need to work that problem. The other thing that was very important is, what do you look at? And all too often, I think organizations become seduced by what I call the measures of performance. We all work hard, we're all passionate about something, and so when you say, well, how are you doing? People will tend to tell you how much effort they've put into a particular endeavor. And what we did was to kind of disabuse everybody of the measures of performance, which are laudable, but insignificant, and go after measures of effectiveness. What do you get out of the effort that you're putting into something? And that's a hard adjustment to make, because a lot of times you put effort into something and nothing happens. And it can become very discouraging. And then the other thing that we had to deal with as well was initially, when we started to look at where some of the opportunities were, a comment would be made, well, you're only going to get 2% out of that. Well, 2% when you have almost 300 ships, if you're getting 2% out of every ship, for a lifetime of 20 or 30 years, that starts to add up. And so we had to start thinking in longer terms as to what the return on the investment was. And so some of the things that we did that were really pretty simple. I don't know if anybody's ever been out on a speedboat where they have trim tabs in the back that adjust the attitude of the boat so that it's a more efficient form going through the water. Somebody came up with the idea of putting trim tabs on a big warship. You can imagine what that response was when they said, we're going to do that. Well, you put trim tabs on a big destroyer, and you are going to get about 2 or 3% improvement in fuel usage. Some of the other things, we replaced the lighting with LEDs. Little things there. We also, almost all the ships that we have in the Navy, those that aren't nuclear powered, and we have about 17% of the fleet that's nuclear power, so we start with a pretty good energy advantage on that. But we found in all the other ships that are mainly gas turbine powered that if we put in continuous water wash, the engines were cleaner, they burned more efficiently, and we got savings out of that. We put in better voyage planning so that you could get optimum routes based on immediate observed weather. So all of that started to add up, and we began to see some significant improvement. But a lot of this also was just getting people to think more about energy and how to use it. The other thing that we did on the shore side that really got a lot of folks excited, in areas where we have a lot of public housing, and there's an allowance given to everybody that lives there, we started charging for energy use, something that had never happened before. And it was a pretty bumpy few months when we started to do that, because again, you're changing the culture. And we were able to determine a baseline, and then we set a 20% band around that baseline. If you were over, you paid. If you were under, you were reimbursed. We also did some pretty stupid things. We went through a whole trial period to set the baseline, and then the right-hand, left-hand problem, we used as our test case the housing out in Hawaii, which is it's a pretty good, you have a very controlled environment out there. So we set the baselines 3 weeks before we were to charge. We then went in and changed all the meters, which then caused everybody to say, you're going to fix the deal because you set the baseline. So little things like that you don't see coming that you have to deal with. But it made a huge difference. People in their home life are now thinking about energy differently than they used to. And that all adds to this change of culture. The other thing that was the most significant event is war tends to focus people very precisely. And particularly in the two places where we were fighting, Iraq and Afghanistan. Very difficult places, very challenging logistically. And with the advent of improvised explosive devices, you could bet that for every fuel convoy, somebody was going to get killed because of the improvised explosive devices, particularly in Iraq, where they used radio-controlled devices, which were really quite sophisticated. And they would also have counting circuitry in them so that you could drive by, I could drive by, you could drive by, and then number 4 would get it. So you had this sense that everything was fine. And so, that the fewer convoys you drive, the fewer people you'll lose. And that really is the most aggressive metric and the most important metric that you're ever going to deal with in the military. So that was helpful. A company of soldiers or Marines, when they go out on a couple of day patrol or mission, used to take about 700 pounds of batteries with them. And not only are they heavy, but they also displace 700 pounds of other stuff that you may want to have. And so that led to some rapid usage of the solar blankets. So now you have a soldier carrying a solar blanket, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. They work pretty well over there. Now they're able to offload that huge weight because they're normally carrying about 90 pounds plus. And if you can take 5-10 pounds of batteries off of them, that's a big deal. The other thing that we did, the conditions in Iraq and Afghanistan are not the best. Summers are brutal. And the Marines did this one. They found that if you dug a little tunnel about 5 or 6 feet under a tent, took a solar blanket and an electric motor, and you pulled the air through that tunnel, you dropped the tent temperature down about 10 degrees. After a day out in the desert, 10 degrees is pretty refreshing, you know. But again, this was all done with some alternate forms of energy. The other thing that became very apparent with the remote outposts that we had is that we stopped thinking in terms of the cost of a gallon of fuel. And the term that we used in the Navy was that we started to think in terms of the cost of a fully burdened gallon of fuel. And when you get up into the high mountains of Afghanistan, there were times where we were looking at $400 a gallon. Because if you think of it in terms of how do I get the fuel from the port of Karachi, it gets trucked on one of the most tortuous routes you've ever seen. It then goes to a particular place, then has to move. In some cases, you're moving it by helicopter. So you start adding all of that in, and people begin to realize this is a huge cost for us. And so how can you do more distributed systems? How can you rely more on solar, maybe even some wind? And as in all things, you know, the folks back at the headquarters will have all the great ideas. It's the young men and women who are doing the work, they're going to have the best ideas. And a lot of this stuff came from them because they're the ones that are benefiting from it more than anybody else. So those were some of the things that we did there. For the Navy, you know, we started, I would say, an early push into biofuels. And the idea was to make sure that what we had, we could run on alternative fuels. And we started with a couple of demos, and then we decided to make a fairly significant leap and to fly one of our advanced strike fighter aircraft, the type that we fly off the aircraft carriers, on biofuels. And the engineers came in and said, we think that we could probably do this in about 2 years. And my response was, I looked at my watch, looked at the date, and I said, you have 1 year from today, and we want to be supersonic and a Super Hornet. And everybody kind of looked at it and I said, okay. And they immediately, you know, you have to give everything a name. So it became the Green Hornet. And we started down the path, and I think we had a 2-day margin, and we went supersonic in a Hornet. And then shortly thereafter, the Blue Angels, our flight demonstration team that flew here at Fleet Week not too long ago, did an air show with biofuel. And talk about pushing the limits of performance. You don't push it any harder than those guys do in the Blues. So that was, you know, was something that we did. Now we paid dearly to do it. My recollection is that the first gallon that we bought to start down this process, I think we paid like $469 for. That price has come down. It's, you know, it varies depending on the grade that we're dealing with. Some purchases have been 60. We've gotten some for 26. But it's still pretty high, and I'll come back around and talk about, you know, what's going on there. The other thing that we did was, in the way that we accounted for the money, it was pretty disparate. And so what we did was we used Task Force Energy, and they were the kind of the accountants, if you will, for the energy accounts. And they paid attention to how much we were spending, what we were getting out of it. And that was the first time that we had a singular view of our energy initiatives in the Navy. We then stepped it up and set some challenges for ourselves. One was to demonstrate that we could operate a whole collection of ships that we call a strike group. It'll be an aircraft carrier, submarines, some combatants, and then the logistics ships to support it. And we said in 12, we're going to do a demonstration and we will operate a strike group on biofuels. And we just did that this past summer in Hawaii when we did the Rim of the Pacific exercise. We then said by 16, we're going to do a full 6-month overseas deployment on alternative fuels. Now, we gain a lot because the aircraft carrier, which is the centerpiece, is nuclear powered. So that's very helpful for us. So it's really the airplanes. But I'll tell you, those folks use a lot of fuel when they're flying. So this is, no mean feat. Now the cost to do the demonstration in Hawaii was around $12 million, what we paid for that. A lot of money, and again, I'll circle back on that. So those were some of the initiatives. Now, where are we now, and what's going on the energy front? I will tell you that all of the services are still very focused on this because of some of the things that I talked about. It's about people's lives. It's about your sustainability. It's about the ability to operate in remote areas. It's about being cleaner. There's no question about that. So there's great emphasis on it. The concerns I have are that, as we come out of the operations in Afghanistan, are you going to have that focusing effort that we've had, and that people, as I've said, this was a life and death thing for them. And so when you remove that motivation, how do people think differently about it? We're already seeing in Congress a pushback on a lot of the biofuel initiatives that we have. And you can say that, some of it's driven by the fossil fuel lobby up there. That's where some of the stuff generates out of. But I think that there are some folks that are also looking at it from the standpoint of $26 a gallon or $4 a gallon. And, is the military going to swing the market with that investment in it? I'll talk very openly because I'm retired now and I can say anything I want. But what happened, at least in the case of the Navy, they went to the mat on this one. And my sense, it may have been better when you started to see the wind shift to say, I'm going to rethink this and let me take that money, or at least let me take a part of that money and let me put it into R&D, or let me put it into accelerating some of the conservation efforts, the stern flaps, lighting systems, distributed power. There's a great initiative that has just come on the scope that I think is going to be huge for the Army and the Marine Corps, particularly people in remote bases, where if you have small outposts, you'll be running diesel generators, and it's going to be very inefficient because you're not going to be using that much power. And they've been able to capture anywhere between 60 and 85% of the wasted power for use later on. So those types of investments, I think, would have been very hard for people on the Hill to say no to. But the biofuel issue, I think, is going to be a hard one because of the price and because of the politics of it. So I think that's going to be a challenge. The other thing that's happening is if anyone watches defense budgets, it's a very uncertain time right now. There's no question that we are facing some pretty significant fiscal issues, and the military is going to be part of the solution for that. But there's a Budget Control Act that's been put in place, which is a very draconian way of reducing discretionary budgets, both in defense and non-defense. There's essentially no option, if it's enacted, that there'll be $500 billion, roughly, that will be taken out of defense, and it is mandated a certain percentage for every budget line. And then the same number of money, or same amount of money for every year. Now, none of us budget that way. None of us spend money that way. And the idea behind this Budget Control Act wasn't that it was a solution. It was a hammer that if we didn't get the agreement, it was so distasteful that people would compromise. We're not there yet. So how that will affect these accounts, I'm a bit fearful of that. We also have another, if you're a budget wonk, another issue that comes into play. When Congress can't decide on a budget, they do something that's called a continuing resolution. They say, okay, you had this much money last year, you're going to have the same amount of money this year, and oh, by the way, you can't increase numbers in anything, and you can't start anything new. And this is bothersome because there were some new energy initiatives. There's some new R&D, research and development, that we wanted to do. And so now that's kind of in limbo because we can't start anything new. So I think we're going to see in the coming months a bit of a setback on some of our energy initiatives as we go forward. But I do think that it's going to be important in the future that we keep, that the military leadership, Department of Defense leadership, keeps the heat on energy. I'm also encouraged by the fact that it's a lot more bipartisan than it used to be. It used to be, it was all about being green. Well, the whole approach that we took and the underpinning of everything that we did was it was all about being better, more efficient, and more effective. And the green follows that. But it's hard to argue against saving people's lives. It's hard to argue about spending less money, about being less dependent on limited supplies of energy and less dependent on very tenuous supplies of energy. So I think we've been fairly effective in conveying that to the Hill. I think it's also important that we maintain the goals. It will be easy for folks to back away from them, but I think we have to keep the bar where we've set it and continue to push it. I'm encouraged by the young people that serve in the military today because I think they come in with an attitude that's very different than what life was like, when I came in. And for many here, you probably are conjuring up ideas of square-rigged sailing ships and things that I used to deal with. As I said, I think the importance of really investing in research and development is key. And particularly when we're talking about biofuels, how can you scale up and really change the market? That is going to make all the difference in the world. I believe the commercial aviation industry needs to move that way. In fact, I happened to have the television on yesterday, and the CEO of FedEx was on there. And they're doing some terrific things with energy. And like the military, he operates a big fleet of airplanes. He operates a lot of vehicles. And I think as they come online, as the trucking industry changes, that will be extraordinarily helpful. As I said, keeping our eye on the measures of effectiveness and not how much effort we're putting into something is going to be important, and being honest with ourselves as to what those metrics are. I think it's important that as we deal with things that it's science-based, because if you do that, you tend to remove the emotion and the politics from it. It's very hard to argue with hard science. You may get beat up a little bit, particularly in Congress. But if you know you have solid facts, you're going to be in pretty good shape. And then the other thing is continue to focus on the culture. And as I alluded to, we're going to lose, and I say fortunately, a great motivator for changing the culture, and that's when we're no longer having people in harm's way. But there's going to be a price to pay for that because I think a lot of the attention could slip away. I would also say that as you look at least within the government, and you look at the labs that are becoming involved in energy issues, there probably should be a better way of channeling the efforts, focusing the efforts, and then holding the activity accountable. My fear is that in that energy is a very popular thing to be dealing with right now. I hope it doesn't become like puppies on a ball, that everybody's piling on and that there's a flurry of activity, but that we're not channeling the efforts in particular areas, such as scaling the biofuels, looking for better distributed systems, more robust systems that can operate in a very austere environment. I believe that we need to do that. And then the last thing that I would end on is you know, we do energy, but we also have to start thinking very seriously about water and what that will mean for everybody that lives on the planet. So what I'd like to do is stop there and then take any questions that you may have on any topic. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take questions, and we always like to try to start with the students.
Absolutely.
So some of the students with questions. Yeah, okay, there we go.
I was wondering, so you talked a lot about using biofuels as kind of the future fuel, but I was wondering how much you also invest in some other potential fuels, you know, for example, batteries or natural gas or hydrogen or, you know, other kinds of technologies, and why you've really focused in on biofuels, because, you know, that has its own slew of problems as well.
No, great question, and thanks for reminding me that I left some things out. I think one of the reasons that I homed in on that is that we operate, you know, our operational forces, at least in the Navy, is very remote. So, you know, what you're burning, you're taking with you. But we have, in fact, the Navy operates some of the largest solar farms around, particularly out west. We used a lot of the stimulus money that was out there to put in more solar in places where it makes sense. In the West, in particular, we're doing geothermal, and then, of course, gas, I think, will give us some great opportunities. But I would also say that we really need to look at how do we do the distribution systems. You know, if you go around to military installations today, well, pretty much throughout the country, it's a very old distribution system. So how can we operate in a better scheme configuration? Obviously, there's huge investment, both in the public sector, private sector, that has to be put in place there. So, you know, all of those fit in, and most of those are in what I would consider to be the shore area. But we've also set some pretty aggressive goals by 2020 to have 50% of all of our facilities be net zero. So, you know, looking at the energy sources that we have, and how can we build that into the system. So I would say that biofuels, because it's tailored to the type of operations that we do, but solar is big, and geothermal, particularly for the facilities that we have in the West.
Okay, more student questions.
You mentioned diesel generators for remote outposts. I was wondering what the status is of microgrids for those type of situations.
Yeah, I would say that we're nowhere near really, you know, getting into the microgrids. We're still very dependent on the old designs, the old styles, but that's where I think, you know, in previous conferences I've talked about this before, for companies that are interested in trying some technology, and even though the government's processes are, you know, really hard and draconian to work your way through, the point that I make is that within a military base unit, once you get into that, you're going to have some very committed people. You're going to have folks that are very, they tend to be type A's, they're pretty anal about, getting data and information. And they provide some I think some very good environments for experimentation and testing. And so, when I talk to groups where there are commercial interests involved, I really do encourage them to really look at using the military as a test base for that. And particularly looking at how you can partner with the civilian community around it. And then especially for the expeditionary things, when I talked about the weight that a soldier or a Marine is carrying around the mountains of Afghanistan, if there are solutions that lighten that load, they're going to be all over it. So I would encourage that sort of activity. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of different strategies that other foreign militaries might be pursuing that are not biofuel oriented, or if they have just typically different strategies?
Yeah, I mean, we've looked. As we stood up the task force, we looked many places. For example, I went down to Brazil. I thought, it'd be great to get my Brazilian counterpart because they're doing some significant things. His response, because he's a great guy, love him like a brother. He said, I don't have to worry about that stuff. So as formative as we are now, we are really, I think, doing quite well in pressing the envelope. This summer we signed an agreement with Australia to share R&D with them on energy issues, and we also it has always been part of our engagement strategy to look at what can we get, what can we co-develop. I'll tell you, when you go to the Middle East, they're not too keen on alternative forms of energy. They'd like us to keep buying oil, and I was pretty proud of what we had done, and one of my Middle Eastern friends was not enthused at all.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, about the nuclear thing, are you getting new nuclear powered vessels? And I guess, is it the biggest ones that are nuclear powered, or what decides what kind of fuel you use?
Are we going to do more?
Yeah.
My sense is not. And right now we do our aircraft carriers. The aircraft carrier fleet is all nuclear, and all of our submarines are nuclear. The aircraft carriers, because it's the best source of energy to move something that large around the world. It also gives us extraordinary flexibility and capability, because you don't have to worry about refueling it. You do have to worry about taking on gas for the airplanes, but that freedom of movement is extraordinary. And then the nuclear submarine is the true submarine, because you will run out of food before you have to come up for anything else. We make our own atmosphere. We don't have to worry about fuel in the short term. We do monitor the life of the core, and we plan that, and we monitor it very carefully, because we want to get as much out of it as we can. So on any given day, that particular ship can tell you exactly how much more life they have left in it. But the problem that you get into with nuclear power is it's hugely expensive. And it is expensive in building it, but it's also very expensive in maintaining it because of the quality assurance that you have to have on it. And the personnel cost more, because when we train someone in Navy nuclear power, they become extremely marketable. And I'll give you a case in point. Someone will come in the Navy, young person will come in the Navy, and initially they'll serve a 6-year obligation. There was a young woman, when I was on the George Washington, the aircraft carrier. We were in the Middle East. When you're in a war zone, you don't pay tax. And she elected to stay for another turn in the Navy. So she was going to re-enlist for 6 years. She came in with an age waiver from her parents when she was 17. So she's 23 years old, and I handed her a check for $94,000, no tax. When you're 23 years old, high school graduate, that's not a bad thing. And everybody said, I can't believe you're paying people that much to stay in the Navy. And my answer was, and I'll probably pay them more because it's cheaper than starting new with somebody else. But the nuclear operators are in huge demand. And I've had CEOs of nuclear power companies, as they're contemplating building more civilian plants. And they make no bones about it. They'd look at me and they said, we're not worrying about the operators because we know where we're coming to get them. And they're your people. Because there is no other organization. Navy operates the biggest nuclear enterprise in the world. And it is the safest, and the record is absolutely extraordinary. It's because they're built well, but the real secret are the great young people that operate and maintain them. And that's worth something. So when you add things up, and we were looking at building a new class of ship, and we said, let's go nuke. And when we ran all the numbers, even the highest fossil fuel estimates that existed at the time, for 30 years, it was still cheaper to go fossil over nuclear when you add in all the total costs. So they're great, and we used to have more different types of ships, nuclear, but the cost just didn't work out.
What about the new types of nuclear technology?
The new types of technology?
Yeah.
Like, you mean for ships or like small modular reactors? As we're doing the Arctic project, that we're trying to inject small modular reactors into some scenarios that we're doing. Because when you get up in very remote areas, I don't know, if there are better sources of energy than SMRs. So we're kind of giving that a look, and we'll do some gaming with it and things like that. But I think that will, potentially be very, very helpful. And then we are also, trying to talk to some folks within the military and some of the more remote bases as you look at maybe different types of distribution systems and generating systems. And some of the more remote, large installations, our SMR is an option there. Still some way to go on the technology and working our way through it. But I think that there's great potential there, and I'm very interested in pursuing it. I think there was
Okay, I think there was
couple
one
others.
over here, yeah.
Going back to what you were talking about climate,
Yeah.
there's a couple of questions. You mentioned the shipping lanes in the north, and
Right.
25-year time horizon planning for that. I was wondering, are there other things with climate change trajectories that are sure enough that they've entered into that strategic planning? Maybe in particular, like talk about the volatility of weather and change. Is that something that you also come from?
Yeah, not so much the volatility. I think, as we looked at it, water was a big deal because if people don't have access to water, especially if they think somebody else is depriving them of it, it's going to be a bad scenario. We did look at sea level rise, and when you get down into Oceania, some islands are going to go away because they're so low that the seas will overtake them. So, but that's a couple of decades out. We also looked at our base infrastructure in the United States, and there are predictions that in about 40 years, some of those bases are going to be problematic. But also cities like Karachi, which is one of the largest growing mega cities on the planet, that very well could be significantly underwater in a couple of decades.
Ask a quick follow-up. Is the Navy would you characterize it as fully just reactive, or is there any arm that advocates one way or the other?
Well, I think, the whole purpose in doing it was, where do we need to start thinking about new investments? It's one thing to lay those projections out. It's another thing to get people to get a checkbook out and start writing checks. But if you're not even thinking about it, you're not even going to start having that discussion. So that was the whole purpose behind what we were doing there. And,
Okay, maybe we'll take one more and then we're
Okay.
going to wrap up.
Is there any headway to be made within Congress to kind of remove some of the red tape of the federal acquisition regulations that would allow contracting vehicles for the military to go up to commercial off-the-shelf startup companies and energy technologies, rather than have to reinvest that internally to develop those technologies?
Yeah, there are. In fact, I think you're going to see, commercial off-the-shelf COTS technologies coming on, and you are going to see more for the smaller acquisitions. I think there are great opportunities for that. The critics will say it's not hard enough, it can't withstand the wear and tear, but we've had some pretty good success. One of the challenges that we have, for example, in our submarine fleet, we're using a COTS system for really the brains and the eyes and ears of the submarine, and the improvements are coming so fast, and we found ourselves introducing them so fast that we were outpacing the training of the people. And I happened to be aboard one of our newer submarines and talking to a young sailor, and the stuff is really glitzy, it's terrific, and you're just kind of mesmerized by it. And he said, "Sir, could you just slow it down?" He said, we just came off a deployment. We can play this thing like a fine violin. And he said, as soon as we get back home from this deployment, you're going to change it all for limited improvements. So we've got to think through how how fast you introduce things, because there's a trade-off between individual competence and the high end of technology. And I think in so many areas, we've really pressed the technology faster, I think, than we've had to, and we've probably diminished our effectiveness because people aren't able to stay up to speed with things. So, there's a lot that goes into it, and you have to guard against being a dinosaur and saying, "Oh, we're not going to change anything because of the reasons I gave you." And the whole process has to become more nimble. We do have, in my mind, excessive oversight and excessive testing requirements in some cases that inhibit the introduction of new technology. And then the other thing that happens too, which I think has become very unfortunate, is we have become very intolerant of failure. And I maintain that, the best lessons I ever learned weren't because I did something really well. It's when I screwed something up and I said, I'm never going to do that again. And so, I think we do have to allow people to try. And if you fail, not get whacked for it, which is often what will happen on the Hill. Maybe you had a failure, so they're going to cut the budget, when in point of fact, and my sense is many people out here would be, you failed, great, how much more money do you need? And so we've got to change that culture as well, because we've really lost an edge. When you consider that we put a man on the moon in 10 years, I question whether we'd be able to do that today because of the very thing that you're talking about. People would be insisting on milestones and progress reports, and I mean, even as a kid, I remember seeing the rockets blowing up on the launch pad, and nobody stopped that program. Today, I think you would find that happening, and I think that is a very bad thing to happen for this country, because it will remove that spirit of adventure and that risk-taking that really has made us who we are technologically. And we're moving in the wrong direction in the public sector. Private sector out here, you guys are knocking the doors off. But the public sector, this is a bad thing that's happening.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you. Thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.